The alarms inside Vought's pediatric research wing never finished their second cycle. They died mid-scream as every monitor, every light, every camera went dark at the exact same moment, like the building itself had been unplugged from reality. Nurses froze. Scientists stopped breathing. The children strapped to metal tables stared upward as gravity forgot how to work. A purple hand tapped a glass containment wall once, and the glass dissolved without breaking. Beerus walked past rows of children with IV lines feeding compound V into their veins, his eyes half-lidded with bored irritation. He didn't look angry. He looked offended. Wise floated behind him, calmly observing, staff in hand, as if touring a museum of failed ideas. In another part of the city, Homelander paused mid-speech as every Supe in a 50-mile radius felt something ancient press down on their existence. And none of them understood the same horrifying truth at once. This wasn't an invasion. This was a god noticing a mistake. And far above the earth, something had already begun deciding whether this world deserved to continue existing at all. What happens next isn't a battle. It's a judgment that unfolds piece by piece, and you won't see the consequences coming until it's far too late. Subscribe once, because missing the next part means missing the moment this world realizes what it has attracted. The pediatric wing of Vought Tower did not understand what was happening, only that the air itself felt heavier than it had seconds ago. Nurses tried to move and found their limbs resisting them, as if the floor had quietly increased gravity without asking permission. IV pumps continued their steady rhythm, pushing compound V into small veins, while the children on the tables stared upward in confused silence. Beerus walked through the corridor without acknowledging the humans pressed flat against the walls by a force they couldn't name. His tail swayed lazily behind him. His expression was not rage, not urgency, but a thin line of visible annoyance forming at the corner of his mouth. Wise followed, floating rather than walking, calmly taking in the environment like a scholar observing a peculiar insect colony. They stopped in front of the first operating room. Inside, a 6-year-old boy trembled on a metal table as a team of scientists adjusted dosage levels on a glowing screen. None of them could turn around. None of them could even blink. Beerus tapped the glass with one finger, and the entire wall disintegrated into dust that fell straight downward without sound. Wise tilted his head slightly, examining the IV bag. "Synthetic enhancement serum," he said in a conversational tone. "Crude molecular rewriting. They are attempting to force divinity through chemistry." Beerus stepped inside, looking at the child, then at the tube feeding the blue liquid into his arm. He pinched the tube between 2 fingers. The compound V inside it evaporated instantly, leaving the line empty and dry as if it had never carried anything. "This," Beerus said quietly, "is offensive." Across the city, Homelander paused mid-sentence during a live Vought press briefing. His smile faltered for half a second, so brief the cameras barely caught it. Something pressed against his senses, not physically, but instinctively. His body reacted before his mind could process it. For the first time in years, Homelander felt small. The crowd didn't notice, but A-Train, standing off to the side, felt his knees weaken. Queen Maeve looked toward the ceiling without knowing why. Every Supe in the building felt the same invisible weight settle into their bones. Back in the lab, one of the scientists began crying without realizing it. Tears slid down his face as he remained frozen in place. Beerus walked past him without looking. He moved to the next table, then the next, observing each child with the same distant irritation. "They worship these creations?" Beerus asked. Wise smiled faintly. "The humans believe power is something that can be manufactured, packaged, and sold. These children are long-term investments." Beerus stopped walking. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in comprehension. That was the moment irritation became interest. He raised one hand lazily, and snapped his fingers once. Every IV bag containing compound V in the entire wing turned into harmless saline. The liquid changed color instantly, unnoticed by the humans who still could not move. Machines continued pumping nothing of value into the children's veins. Then Beerus walked out. Security alarms finally began to work again as power returned to the floor. Guards rushed down the corridor, weapons raised, shouting into radios that crackled with panicked voices. They saw the broken glass. They saw the open doors. They saw the children alive but the compound V ruined. They did not see Beerus standing in the hallway. One guard fired his rifle at the floating figure beside him. The bullet stopped 3 feet away from Beerus and hung in the air like metallic insects. Beerus didn't even turn his head. The bullets melted into droplets and fell to the floor with soft pings. Wise glanced at the guards with polite curiosity. They are very committed to misunderstanding the situation. Beerus flicked his finger once toward the ceiling. The entire security team lifted off the ground and pressed gently against it, pinned there without pain, without injury, but completely helpless. Their radios fell and clattered across the floor. "Where is the source?" Beerus asked. Wise closed his eyes briefly, sensing. Below, deep within the structure, the origin point of their serum production. Beerus began walking again. Several floors above, Vought's executive command room was in chaos. Screens flickered between camera feeds showing frozen guards, disabled labs, and confused staff. No one understood how the pediatric compound V reserves had been neutralized in seconds. Stan Edgar watched the footage without speaking. Homelander burst into the room without knocking. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. His eyes kept drifting toward the ceiling as if expecting something to come through it. Edgar didn't look at him. "We are experiencing an anomaly," he said calmly, "an intruder we cannot identify." Homelander straightened his posture. "Then I'll identify it." For the first time in years, Homelander didn't wait for permission. He shot upward through the ceiling in a blur, concrete exploding behind him as he launched into the sky. Beerus and Wise reached the underground production level just as Homelander hovered outside Vought Tower, scanning the building with X-ray vision. What he saw made no sense. A figure inside the structure did not register like a human, or a Supe, or anything biological he understood. It felt like looking at the sun. Homelander descended through the building, smashing through floors until he landed in the corridor ahead of Beerus. Dust filled the air. Debris rained down around him as he stood tall, cape settling behind his shoulders. He saw a small purple figure walking casually toward him. Homelander's eyes glowed red instantly. "You picked the wrong building." Beerus didn't slow down. Homelander fired. The laser beam struck Beerus directly in the chest and vanished without a sound, like light hitting a black hole. Beerus stopped walking, looked down at his chest briefly, then back up at Homelander with mild confusion. Homelander fired again, longer this time, pouring everything into the blast. Wise watched with interest. Beerus raised one finger and tapped the air in front of him. Homelander's beam bent sideways, curving harmlessly into the wall, carving a glowing trench through reinforced steel. Homelander's eyes widened as the beam refused to obey him. Beerus finally spoke. "Are you one of the children?" Homelander charged forward with a scream, fist cocked back with enough force to level a city block. Beerus sighed. He flicked Homelander's forehead with a single finger. The impact sounded like a cannon going off. Homelander's body vanished down the corridor, smashing through 10 reinforced walls before disappearing into darkness below the facility. Silence returned. Beerus resumed walking as if nothing had happened. Wise glanced toward the hole in the corridor. "That one appears emotionally unstable." Beerus didn't respond. His eyes were fixed ahead, sensing the deeper concentration of Compound V beneath them. Far below, Homelander lay embedded in a crater of concrete and steel, ears ringing, vision blurred. For the first time in his life, he felt pain that didn't fade instantly. And for the first time, he felt fear. Above him, Beerus was getting closer to the true source of the serum. And Vought had just realized they hadn't been attacked by a Supe. They had attracted something that did not recognize Supes as anything worth noticing. The lowest level of Vought Tower was never meant to be seen by the public, or even by most of the company's own executives. It sat buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete, biometric locks, and false architectural blueprints designed to mislead anyone trying to map the structure. This was where Compound V was not administered, but created. Beerus stepped out of the elevator shaft he had quietly dismantled to reach it, landing on the polished floor without a sound. Wise floated beside him, looking around with calm interest as rows of glass chambers stretched across the enormous underground facility. Inside them, glowing blue liquid circulated through complex machinery that hummed like a living organism. Scientists ran between terminals in panicked confusion. Emergency protocols were being shouted over loudspeakers that contradicted each other every few seconds. No one understood why all external communication had died or why security feeds from above were showing impossible footage. Beerus walked past them as if they weren't there. A woman in a lab coat tried to run past him toward an emergency exit. She froze mid-stride as gravity quietly tripled around her body, pinning her to the floor without injury. Her eyes darted wildly as Beerus passed without even glancing down. Wise observed the equipment carefully. Remarkably ambitious for a species that still argues about borders and currencies, he said lightly. They have reverse-engineered fragments of power they do not understand. Beerus stopped in front of the largest central vat. Inside, Compound V churned like a glowing ocean, feeding into dozens of distribution lines that ran upward through the building and outward into the city's hidden storage sites. The entire system pulsed rhythmically, like a heart-pumping artificial divinity into the world. Beerus stared at it in silence. "So this," he said quietly, "is the source of their mistake." Wise nodded. "Yes, this is where they attempt to manufacture gods." Beerus raised his hand slowly and extended one finger toward the glass. He didn't fire a blast, he didn't charge energy, he simply touched the surface. The entire vat went dark. Not cracked, not shattered. The Compound V inside it lost its glow instantly, turning into a dull, lifeless liquid that sloshed uselessly against the glass. The hum of the machinery died in the same instant, plunging the entire lab into an eerie, hollow quiet. Every scientist in the room felt it without understanding what had happened. Years of research had just become water. Alarms erupted seconds later as systems detected total failure across every production line. Backup generators kicked in, but there was nothing to power anymore. Pumps continued running, pushing meaningless fluid through pipes that no longer carried anything valuable. One of the senior researchers fell to his knees, staring at a tablet showing flatline data. "It's gone," he whispered. "The compound structure, it's gone." Beerus turned away from the vat, as if he had lost interest already. Above them, Homelander clawed his way out of the crater he had been embedded in. His ears were still ringing. His vision struggled to refocus. Rage began replacing fear as humiliation burned through his chest. He shot upward again, flying toward the lowest levels with murderous intent. He didn't care what this thing was anymore. He only cared that it had touched him. Back in the lab, a group of armed security forces stormed through reinforced doors, weapons raised. They shouted commands that died in their throats when they saw Beerus standing in the center of the facility like he belonged there. They opened fire. The gunshots never reached him. Each bullet stopped midair, hanging motionless before quietly dropping to the ground. Beerus didn't acknowledge the attack. Instead, he looked around at the network of pipes running through the ceiling. "This is not a single location," he said. "They have spread it everywhere." Wise smiled gently. "A distribution network. They plan for scale." Beerus exhaled slowly, irritation deepening. "Then the problem is not this room." He snapped his fingers. Across New York, hidden Vought storage facilities holding Compound V reserves suddenly lost power. The glowing blue liquid inside thousands of containers turned dull and useless in the same instant. Scientists miles away screamed in confusion as years of stockpiled serum became worthless. Vought didn't just lose production. They lost every drop they had. Homelander burst through the lab ceiling like a missile, landing hard enough to crack the floor. Dust filled the air as he stood, chest heaving, eyes burning with fury. "This ends now," he growled. Beerus looked at him with visible boredom. Homelander launched forward again, faster than before, throwing a punch with everything he had. Beerus stepped half an inch to the side. The punch missed completely, shattering a control panel behind him into sparks and debris. Homelander spun and attacked again. Beerus gently placed his palm on Homelander's chest and pushed. Not hard. Homelander's body slid backward across the floor, carving a trench through reinforced steel as if he weighed nothing at all. He slammed into a bank of servers, destroying them in a cascade of electrical fire. Beerus didn't pursue him. "You are loud," Beerus said calmly, "and unnecessary." Homelander tried to stand. His muscles trembled. His confidence was breaking faster than his body. For the first time, he realized this wasn't a fight. He wasn't being overpowered. He was being ignored. Wise watched with quiet fascination. "He is accustomed to being the apex of his environment," he noted. "This must be disorienting." Beerus turned away from Homelander again and looked up toward the surface of the city. "This entire world is built on this substance," he said. "They have altered their natural order for it." Wise nodded, "which means the consequences will not remain localized." Beerus raised his hand slightly. Across the city, Supes began to feel something terrifying. A train stumbled mid-step as his speed vanished without warning. Queen Maeve felt her strength drain like water through her fingers. Starlight's glow flickered and died. Dozens of lesser-known Supes collapsed in confusion as the artificial power in their bodies destabilized. Compound V inside them wasn't destroyed. It was being rejected. Homelander felt it too. A strange weakness crept into his limbs, not enough to remove his strength, but enough to make him understand something was very wrong. He looked up at Beerus with genuine panic for the first time. "What did you do?" he demanded. Beerus didn't answer. Because he wasn't talking to Homelander anymore. He was looking at the world. And judging it. The first reports didn't come from Vought Tower. They came from hospitals. Emergency rooms across New York began admitting Supes who could not explain what was happening to them. Some complained of dizziness, others of sudden muscle weakness. A few collapsed entirely, their abilities flickering unpredictably like faulty wiring. Doctors ran tests that made no sense, because nothing in medical science could explain why a person who could lift a truck now struggled to lift their own arm. Within minutes, Vought's internal communication network was flooded. Field agents reported the same pattern from Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami. Supes in every major city were experiencing the same destabilization. The company's private satellites confirmed that this wasn't localized to New York. It was everywhere. Stan Edgar stood in the command room, hands behind his back, watching the screens update in real time. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice. But for the first time in years, he had no explanation ready. A technician turned toward him, pale and shaking. "Sir, All compound V reserves are reading as chemically inert. Every facility, every vault. Edgar didn't respond immediately. Homelander stumbled into the room seconds later, slower than usual, breathing harder than he should have been. Everyone noticed it. No one said anything. "What did you do?" Homelander demanded. Edgar finally looked at him. "We did nothing." In the underground lab, Beerus walked slowly between the dead machines while Wise observed the frozen scientists still pinned to the floor by invisible pressure. The panic in their eyes had shifted into something else now. Confusion, disbelief, the kind of dread that comes when a lifetime of knowledge becomes useless in seconds. Wise gestured toward the pipes lining the ceiling. Their entire civilization of power was built on that serum. Removing it is educational. Beerus paused. "I did not remove it." Wise tilted his head slightly. "No." Beerus glanced toward the surface. "I told it to stop pretending." Above them, Vought's research teams frantically analyzed samples of compound V from blood draws, storage units, and lab remnants. The molecular structure was still present, but it no longer reacted. It no longer enhanced. It simply existed like a fossil of something that had once been alive. One scientist whispered, "It's like the compound lost permission to function." Edgar watched that feed without blinking. In another part of the city, Billy Butcher stood in a cluttered apartment with Huey and Mother's Milk, staring at a news broadcast showing confused Supes being wheeled into ambulances. The headline crawled across the screen: "Widespread Supe medical emergency, cause unknown." Butcher took a slow sip from his glass. "That's new." Huey looked uneasy. "You think Vought did this?" Butcher shook his head. "No, if Vought had this kind of off switch, we'd all be dead already." He leaned closer to the TV, eyes narrowing. "Something else did this." Back in Vought Tower, Edgar received the first report from international branches. Supes in Europe, Supes in Asia, same symptoms, same failure. The global scale of it finally settled into the room like a suffocating fog. This wasn't an attack on Vought. This was an attack on the concept of Supes. Homelander paced like a trapped animal. "Find it," he snapped. "Find whatever did this." Edgar looked at him carefully. "You encountered it already, didn't you?" Homelander didn't answer. He remembered the flick of a finger, the casual push, the complete lack of effort. And for the first time, he didn't trust himself to go back. In the underground lab, one of the scientists finally managed to move as the pressure holding them down eased slightly. He scrambled toward a terminal, hands shaking as he tried to restart systems that refused to respond. Beerus watched him with detached curiosity. "Why do they continue?" he asked. Wise smiled faintly. "Because they believe this can be fixed. Mortals assume every problem has a solution if they are clever enough." Beerus turned toward the scientist. The man froze again as Beerus' gaze settled on him. "You made this," Beerus said quietly. The scientist's lips trembled. We were improving humanity." Beerus' expression didn't change. "You were manufacturing worship." The man didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Tears slid down his face. Beerus raised one hand slightly, and every remaining screen in the lab flickered on at once. Live feeds from hospitals, Vought offices, news stations across the world filled the displays. Supes everywhere struggling, confused, afraid. The scientist stared at the screens in horror. "This," Beerus said, gesturing lazily, "is the cost of pretending to be gods." Wise observed quietly. "You are being generous. You have not destroyed anything yet." Beerus lowered his hand. "I am deciding," he replied. Above them, Edgar finally issued a global order. All Vought operations were to halt immediately. All Supe deployments suspended. All public messaging controlled. They would present this as a temporary medical anomaly while they searched for answers. But answers were not coming. because the source of the problem was not technological, chemical, or biological. It was judgment. And for the first time in its history, Vought International realized it was not facing a rival corporation, a rogue soup, or a government investigation. It was facing something that did not recognize its existence as important. Far below, Beerus looked toward the ceiling again. "I want to see more," he said. Wise nodded. "The city." Beerus shook his head. "The world they built with this." And when he stepped forward, the entire underground facility trembled slightly, not from force, but from the quiet understanding that whatever happened next would not be contained within these walls. New York did not panic all at once. It unraveled in layers. At first, it was just confusion. Sirens moved more frequently than usual. Ambulances carried Supes instead of civilians. News anchors repeated the same cautious phrases about temporary instability and medical evaluations, while social media flooded with shaky phone videos of heroes who could no longer perform basic feats they had built careers on. Then the crime started. Not because criminals had suddenly become braver, but because they noticed something subtle. Supes were not responding as quickly. Patrol routes thinned. Response times lagged. For the first time in years, the city felt unguarded. Beerus stood on the edge of a skyscraper, looking down at the streets with quiet disinterest. Cars moved. People argued. Helicopters circled in the distance. The world below continued as if nothing cosmic had happened, unaware that the foundation of its power structure had already cracked. Wise hovered beside him. "They are very dependent on artificial guardians," he observed. "Removing that illusion creates social turbulence." Beerus watched a group of police officers struggling to restrain a man who had once been a low-level soup known for enhanced strength. Now he thrashed like a normal human, confused and terrified, shouting that something was wrong with him. "They built a society around weakness pretending to be strength," Beerus said. In Vought Tower, panic had finally replaced discipline. Executives shouted over each other in emergency meetings. Legal teams were already drafting damage control narratives. Marketing departments scrambled to suppress footage of failing Supes before it reached the public. Stan Edgar remained composed, but even he had stopped pretending this was manageable. "Find the entity," he said calmly. "Everything else is irrelevant." They had no name for Beerus, no classification, no data. Only security footage of a small purple figure, walking through their most secure facilities like they were empty hallways. Homelander watched the footage in silence. He replayed the moment Beerus flicked his forehead again and again, as if searching for a hidden trick, something he had missed, some weakness he could exploit. But every time he watched it, the same realization settled in deeper. There had been no effort in that motion. Across the city, Billy Butcher and the boys moved through the chaos with cautious curiosity. Huey kept checking his phone, watching clips of Supes stumbling in public. Mother's Milk frowned as reports piled up. "This doesn't feel like an accident," MM said. Butcher nodded slowly. "It is." He looked up toward the skyline, eyes narrowing. Something just kicked the table over. Back on the rooftop, Beerus, ears twitched slightly as distant explosions echoed through the city. A group of criminals had attempted a coordinated bank robbery, assuming Soup response would be delayed. They were right, but what they didn't account for was ordinary law enforcement reacting with desperation. Gunfire erupted, civilians screamed. Beerus watched without emotion. "Do you intend to intervene?" Wise asked lightly. Beerus shook his head. "This is not my mistake to fix." He turned his gaze toward Vought Tower in the distance. "That building," he said, "it is the center of their worship." Wise smiled faintly. "Yes, their temple." Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly. Then they should see what happens when their temple loses favor. At that moment, every electronic screen in Times Square flickered. Advertisements vanished. News feeds cut out. Emergency broadcasts died mid-sentence. The massive digital billboards went black for 2 full seconds before lighting up again with a single image captured from Vaught's own security footage. Beerus walking calmly through the pediatric wing. People in the street stopped and stared upward. The footage played without sound, glass dissolving, children on tables, scientists frozen. Beerus passing through it all without urgency, without aggression, like a god inspecting livestock. Vaught's internal systems had not released this. They had not authorized anything. Stan Edgar watched in horror as the same footage appeared on screens across the city. "Shut it down," he ordered. They couldn't. Every network was hijacked by something they did not control. Homelander stared at the screens, jaw tightening. For the first time, the public saw the truth without filters, without branding, without music or slogans. They saw something enter Vought and treat it like it was nothing. Panic spread faster than any virus. Beerus watched the city react, eyes half-lidded. "They needed to see it," he said. Wise tilted his head, "So they understand." "No," Beerus replied, "so they stopped pretending." Helicopters began circling Vought Tower in greater numbers now. Military vehicles moved through the streets below. The U.S. government had been forced to acknowledge that something beyond corporate control was happening, and they were preparing to respond the only way they knew how. With force. Beerus sensed it before Wise did. Jets lifting off, missile systems activating, radar locks forming on Vought Tower and the surrounding airspace. Humans preparing to attack something they didn't understand because they could not tolerate not being in control. Beerus sighed softly. "They always do this," he said. Wise smiled. "It is their instinct." Beerus stepped off the rooftop and began descending slowly toward the streets below, not falling, not flying, simply lowering himself as if gravity had agreed to cooperate. He wanted to be closer when they tried. Because the moment the military acted, this situation would stop being about Compound V and start being about whether this world was worth sparing at all. The order did not come from Vought. It came from Washington. By the time the Pentagon had verified the footage hijacking public screens across New York, multiple intelligence agencies had already flagged the same anomaly, an unknown entity inside Vought facilities that no sensor, satellite, or biometric system could properly identify. Heat signatures failed. Facial recognition returned nothing. Infrared showed a silhouette that did not behave like a living organism. They did not know what Beerus was, but they knew one thing with certainty. He was not human. Fighter jets lifted off from nearby bases within minutes. Missile systems were armed. Ground units began sealing off entire blocks around Vought Tower. The official reasoning was containment. Unofficially, it was fear. Beerus stood calmly in the middle of an empty intersection, looking up at the sky as the first jets roared overhead. Civilians had already fled the area after the screen broadcasts, leaving the streets eerily quiet except for the distant echo of sirens and helicopter blades. Wise floated beside him, watching the approaching aircraft with mild interest. "They believe volume of force compensates for lack of understanding," he noted. Beerus didn't respond. The first missile launched before the jets even completed their second pass. It screamed downward toward Beerus with perfect targeting, guided by systems designed to hit moving vehicles at supersonic speeds. The explosion lit up the entire street in a blinding flash, shattering windows for blocks and sending shockwaves through nearby buildings. Smoke swallowed the intersection. Military command centers watched the live feed, waiting for confirmation. The smoke cleared slowly. Beerus was still standing in the exact same spot. His clothes weren't burned. The pavement beneath him wasn't even cracked. The explosion had simply happened around him and gone nowhere. Wise examined the air thoughtfully. "Quite energetic," he commented. Beerus looked up at the jets again, now circling in tighter patterns. He raised one hand lazily. The next missile launched and stopped midair. Every soldier watching the feed leaned forward in disbelief as the missile hung motionless 50 feet above the street, frozen like a toy suspended by invisible wires. A second missile launched. It stopped too. Then a third. Beerus rotated his finger slightly. All 3 missiles turned in the air and pointed back toward the sky. The jets tried to break formation, but it didn't matter. The missiles accelerated upward at impossible angles, chasing the aircraft with the same precision they had been designed for. Pilots screamed into radios as they ejected seconds before their jets were swallowed by fireballs in the sky. Beerus lowered his hand. Burning debris rained harmlessly into the empty streets. In Vought Tower, Homelander watched the footage with growing unease. This wasn't a Supe. This wasn't an enemy. This was something the military itself could not even inconvenience. Stan Edgar stood beside him, silent, absorbing the implications. "This is no longer a Vought problem," Edgar said quietly. Homelander didn't look at him. "No," he replied, "it's mine." But his voice lacked conviction. On the streets below, armored military vehicles rolled into position. Soldiers poured out, forming defensive lines with heavy weapons aimed directly at Beerus. Their training overrode their fear. They fired in coordinated volleys, filling the air with tracer rounds and explosive shells. Beerus didn't even look at them. The bullets curved gently around his body like water flowing around a stone, embedding themselves harmlessly into the asphalt behind him. Explosions detonated meters away, close enough to rattle buildings, but none touched him. Wise watched with polite curiosity. They are very persistent. Beerus finally turned his head toward the soldiers. He exhaled softly. The air in front of him compressed invisibly and expanded outward in a silent wave. It wasn't a blast. It wasn't visible. It was simply pressure. Every armored vehicle flipped onto its side as if pushed by a giant hand. Soldiers were lifted off their feet and gently thrown backward across the street, landing hard but alive, too shocked to even scream. Beerus did not want them dead. He wanted them to understand. High above, government satellites recorded everything. Officials watched in stunned silence as their best hardware failed to even touch the target. The conclusion formed quickly and quietly among them. This entity could not be fought. And they had just proven it. Back in the city, people hiding in apartments and subway stations watched the same footage spreading across phones and televisions. The narrative had already shifted. This was no longer about Supes failing. This was about something far worse arriving. Billy Butcher watched from a distance with binoculars, standing on a rooftop with Huey and Mother's milk. He lowered them slowly, lips tightening. "That," he muttered, "isn't something you fight." Huey swallowed. "Then what is it?" Butcher stared toward the smoke-filled street, where Beerus stood calmly among overturned vehicles. "It's something you pray doesn't notice you." Beerus looked around at the wreckage with faint irritation. "This is what they do when they don't understand," he said. Wise nodded. "Yes, they escalate." Beerus' gaze shifted toward Vought Tower again. "And they still believe the problem is me." He stepped forward, beginning to walk toward the building. Behind him, soldiers struggled to stand. Commanders shouted into radios that had no useful answers. The military had thrown everything it could in under 5 minutes. And it had achieved nothing. As Beerus walked, every camera in the city turned toward him without being commanded to. Every screen picked up the live feed again, as if the world itself had decided this was the only thing worth watching. Because the moment the military attacked, this stopped being an incident. It became a demonstration. And everyone watching understood the same terrifying truth at once. This being had not come to fight. He had come to decide. The shift did not happen in a headline. It happened in silence. Across the world, Supes sat in hospital beds, apartments, corporate offices, and alleyways, staring at their own hands as if seeing them for the first time. The strength they had relied on for years now felt distant, unreliable, like a memory fading too quickly to hold on to. Some tried to demonstrate their abilities and failed. Others refused to try at all, afraid of confirming what they already suspected. The illusion of superiority was evaporating. News networks stopped referring to them as heroes and started calling them affected individuals. Medical analysts speculated about chemical failures. Psychologists spoke about collective trauma. No one dared say the real thing out loud. Something had turned them off. In Vought Tower, Stan Edgar watched global feeds with the composure of a man whose empire was quietly dissolving. Legal teams were overwhelmed. Governments demanded answers Vought could not provide. Investors were already panicking. The company's entire value was built on the promise of power that no longer functioned reliably. Edgar did not shout. He simply asked one question. Where is he now? No one had to ask who he meant. Cameras across New York tracked Beerus as he walked steadily toward Vought Tower, passing through streets littered with the remains of military vehicles. Civilians watched from windows and rooftops, phones raised, recording without understanding what they were witnessing. Homelander stood in the command room, staring at the screen with something dangerously close to dread. He could feel the weakness in his own body now, subtle but undeniable. His strength remained, but it felt less absolute, less guaranteed. And for someone like Homelander, uncertainty was worse than pain. He's coming here, Homelander said quietly. Edgar nodded, yes. There was no strategy to discuss, no plan to form. Nothing in Vought's history prepared them for an entity that did not care about negotiation, leverage, or image. Far below the city, Billy Butcher watched the same footage from a different angle. He leaned against a brick wall, cigarette burning between his fingers as Huey nervously refreshed social feeds. Supes are panicking, Huey said. Forums are full of them asking what's happening. Butcher smirked faintly. Good. Mother's Milk frowned. This isn't good, this is bigger than Vought. Butcher's eyes stayed on the screen where Beerus walked without urgency. Yeah, he agreed. That's what makes it interesting. Beerus reached the base of Vought Tower and stopped. He looked up at the massive structure, glass reflecting the sky like a monument to human ambition. Wise floated beside him, observing the building with academic curiosity. This is where they centralize their worship, Wise said. Beerus nodded slightly. Inside, every executive, scientist, and security officer felt the same chill pass through them, as if the building itself had realized something was standing outside. Homelander took a step toward the elevator, then stopped. He did not want to meet Beerus again. But he knew he had to. Beerus raised his hand toward the tower. He didn't fire a blast, he didn't strike the building. He simply closed his fingers slowly, like grasping something invisible. Every piece of glass on the exterior of Vought Tower shattered at once. Thousands of windows exploded outward in a cascading wave that echoed across the city like thunder. Shards rained down the sides of the building, glittering in the sunlight as people below screamed and ran for cover. The structure remained standing, but its image, its polished, untouchable image, was gone in seconds. Inside, executives dove under desks as glass tore through conference rooms. Alarm systems screamed. Emergency lights flickered to life. Stan Edgar did not move. He watched the monitors calmly. He's not attacking, Edgar said quietly. Homelander looked at him sharply. Then what is he doing? Edgar's eyes stayed on the screen. He's humiliating us. Beerus lowered his hand. He stepped forward and walked directly through the front doors of Vought Tower as if they had never been locked. Security teams that rushed toward him found themselves unable to move again, gently pinned to the walls without injury. Wise followed, staff tapping lightly against the marble floor. Beerus did not look at the people around him. He looked at the architecture, the branding, the giant holographic images of Supes that still flickered weakly in the lobby. "False gods," he muttered. Homelander finally stepped into the lobby from a side corridor. This time he did not attack. He stood still, watching Beerus approach, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "You came for me," Homelander said, forcing steadiness into his voice. Beerus walked past him without stopping. "No," he replied calmly. Homelander turned slowly as Beerus continued deeper into the building, heading toward the executive floors. For the first time in his life, Homelander realized something horrifying. He was not the center of this story. Behind him, employees watched in stunned silence as Beerus entered the elevators without pressing a button. The doors closed, and the elevator began rising on its own. Wise smiled faintly. "They will begin to understand soon." Beerus' eyes remained half-lidded. "Yes," he said, "they are starting to realize what they are not." Outside, people stared at the shattered tower, at the footage playing across every screen, at Supes who could no longer reassure them. And the world slowly understood a truth it had avoided for decades. Supes were never the apex. They were placeholders. And something far older had just arrived to correct the mistake. Billy Butcher had spent years trying to break Vought from the outside. Bombs, blackmail, sabotage, alliances with people he despised, none of it had come close to doing what this purple stranger had accomplished by simply walking through the front door. Vought wasn't bleeding. It was exposed, stripped of the myth it had spent decades selling to the world. Butcher watched Beerus' elevator feed from a stolen tablet, eyes sharp with interest instead of fear. "That thing," he said slowly, "doesn't care about Supes. It cares about the reason Supes exist." Huey looked at him nervously. "You're saying we should talk to it?" Butcher shook his head. "No, you don't talk to a hurricane. You just figure out where it's headed and get out of the way." Mother's Milk frowned. "Or get crushed." Butcher's gaze returned to the screen. "Or let it crush the right things." Inside Vought Tower, the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor without any command. Glass crunched under Beerus' feet as he stepped out into a corridor designed for power meetings and media tour. The polished walls were now jagged and broken, reflecting distorted images of terrified staff hiding in offices. Stan Edgar stood waiting at the end of the hall. He did not run. He did not hide. He stood with his hands behind his back, posture straight, eyes calm as Beerus approached. Homelander remained several steps behind, unwilling to get closer than necessary. Wise observed Edgar with interest. "This one is different," he murmured. Beerus stopped in front of Edgar. "You built this," Beerus said. Edgar met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." There was no arrogance in his voice, no denial, just acknowledgement. "You created the substance that altered this world's balance," Beerus continued. Edgar nodded once. "Yes." Homelander watched in disbelief. No threats, no bargaining, just quiet honesty. Beerus tilted his head slightly, studying the man. "Why?" Edgar didn't hesitate. "Control." The answer hung in the air without shame. Wise smiled faintly. "Efficient." Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in understanding. "You manufactured power to manage fear." Edgar replied calmly. "We manufactured power because humans fear being powerless." Beerus stared at him for several seconds. This was the first human he had encountered who did not beg, panic, or pretend. Edgar did not try to justify what Vought had done. He simply accepted it. That honesty, Beerus said quietly, is the only interesting thing here. Homelander stepped forward, frustration finally boiling over. You're talking like he's the problem. I'm the strongest person on this planet. Beerus glanced at him briefly. No, he said. That single word landed harder than any physical blow. Beerus turned back to Edgar. You understand what happens next? Edgar nodded again. Yes. And for the first time, a flicker of something crossed his eyes. Not fear. Resignation. Outside the building, news helicopters circled at a safe distance, broadcasting live footage of the shattered tower. The world watched as the mysterious being stood face to face with the man who ran the most powerful corporation on Earth. Billy Butcher watched the same feed with a growing realization. This isn't random, he muttered. Huey looked at him. What? Butcher pointed at the screen. It's judging the source, not the symptoms. Inside, Beerus raised one hand slightly and gestured around the executive floor. Everything built from this, he said, is unstable. Edgar didn't argue. Beerus closed his fingers slowly. Every hard drive, server, and data center on the executive level fried instantly. Sparks erupted from walls. Screens exploded into static. Decades of secret research, hidden contracts, blackmail archives, and classified files were erased in a second. Vought didn't just lose Compound V. It lost its memory. Homelander stared in shock. You can't. Beerus didn't even look at him. Wise tapped his staff lightly on the floor. Fascinating. He is dismantling them without killing them. Beerus lowered his hand. I have not decided yet, he said. Stan Edgar watched the smoke rising from ruined systems. He understood perfectly. This was not destruction. This was evaluation. Far across the city, Supes watched the broadcast with growing panic. They were no longer worried about their powers returning. They were worried about what would happen if they didn't. Because the being on screen clearly had not finished. Billy Butcher put out his cigarette and stood up straight. All right, he said quietly, time to move. Mother's Milk looked at him. Move where? Butcher's eyes stayed on Beerus. Closer. Because for the first time in his life, Butcher realized something unbelievable. The thing destroying Vought hated Supes more than he did. And that made it useful. Inside Vought Tower, Beerus turned away from Edgar and began walking back toward the elevators. Homelander watched him go, feeling smaller with every step. What are you going to do? Homelander asked. Beerus didn't stop walking. I am still deciding if this world is worth correcting, he replied calmly. And the moment he said it, everyone watching understood something terrifying. This wasn't over. This was only the midpoint of his judgment. Billy Butcher had no intention of fighting Beerus. He intended to aim him. As Vought Tower smoldered from within and global news cycles spiraled into panic, Butcher led Huey and Mother's Milk through side streets toward the chaos perimeter. Military cordons had thinned after their humiliating failure, leaving gaps that a determined group could slip through without much resistance. Huey kept glancing at his phone. You really think this is smart? Butcher didn't slow down. Smart? No. Useful? Maybe. Mother's Milk shook his head. You're talking about steering a god. Butcher smirked faintly. I'm talking about pointing out where the rot is worst. Inside Vought Tower, Beerus descended the elevator in silence. Wise floated beside him, staff resting lightly against his shoulder. The building felt different now, quieter, hollow, like something important had already been removed from it. You are being patient, Wise observed. Beerus' eyes remained half-lidded. They are revealing themselves. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, shattered glass crunched underfoot again. Security teams still pinned to walls watched helplessly as Beerus stepped outside into the street. Across the road, Butcher stood waiting. Not hiding, not running. Waiting. Huey and Mother's Milk stood a few steps behind him, visibly uncomfortable with the plan they didn't fully understand. Soldiers nearby shouted for them to clear the area, but no one dared get close to Beerus anymore. Beerus stopped when he saw Butcher. He tilted his head slightly. "You are not afraid," Beerus said. Butcher shrugged. "Not of you." Wise smiled with interest, honest again. Beerus studied Butcher for a moment. "You hate the altered ones." Butcher nodded. "I hate what made them." Beerus' gaze sharpened slightly. "You understand the difference." Butcher gestured vaguely toward the skyline. Vought made a business out of gods, sold them like cereal, lied to everyone about what they were. Beerus didn't respond. But he didn't walk away either. Butcher took that as permission. "There's more," he said. "Labs, facilities, places worse than the tower, places where they test things they don't show on billboards." Wise glanced at Beerus. "He is offering guidance." Beerus' tail flicked lazily. "He is offering targets." Butcher didn't smile. "You're already doing what I've wanted for years. I'm just telling you where to look next." For a long moment, no one spoke. Helicopters circled above. Cameras zoomed in, broadcasting the strange meeting to the entire world. People watched in disbelief as a normal human spoke calmly to the being that had dismantled Vought in a day. Beerus finally turned his eyes toward the horizon. "Show me," he said. Butcher exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply turned and started walking toward an unmarked van parked nearby. Huey whispered, "This is insane." Butcher replied quietly, "Yeah, but it's working." Inside the van, Butcher pulled up stolen maps and files on a tablet. Locations of black sites Vought had buried for decades. Testing facilities where failed Supes were experimented on. Storage bunkers no executive would admit existed. Beerus glanced at the screen briefly. "You hide your worst actions underground," he said. Butcher nodded. "That's where the truth lives." Wise looked delighted. A guided tour of moral decay. Beerus didn't enter the van. He simply looked at the first location. Then he vanished. No sound, no flash. He was simply no longer there. A second later, Wise disappeared as well. Butcher stared at the empty street for a moment, then let out a low whistle. "Well, that's efficient." Across the country, in a remote desert facility that didn't officially exist, alarms suddenly activated without explanation. Scientists looked up from experiments involving restrained test subjects injected with unstable versions of Compound V. The air changed. Beerus appeared in the center of the room. He looked at the restrained humans, at the mutated forms, at the fear in their eyes. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, his expression shifted from irritation to something colder. Understanding. Wise appeared beside him, surveying the room quietly. "This is significantly worse than the tower." Beerus nodded once. "Yes," he said softly, "this is where they stopped pretending." Back in New York, Butcher watched the news feed as reports began pouring in from a classified site that had suddenly gone dark. Satellite imagery showed structures collapsing inward without explosions, like the ground itself had decided to swallow them. Huey looked at the screen. "He's not attacking cities." Butcher nodded. "He's attacking secrets." And that was when Butcher realized something important. Beerus wasn't just destroying Vought. He was exposing everything humanity had tried to hide behind it. The desert facility had been designed to survive scandals, audits, even small-scale military strikes. It had never been designed to survive being noticed by a god. Beerus stood in the center of the main testing chamber, surrounded by reinforced steel walls and observation decks, where scientists stared down at him in frozen terror. Below them, Restrained test subjects struggled against metal restraints bolted into the floor, humans twisted by unstable versions of Compound V, their bodies caught between transformation and collapse. Wise walked slowly along the perimeter, examining notes left open on digital displays. They were attempting to stabilize failure, he observed calmly, recycling broken results into new experiments. Beerus didn't respond immediately. He looked at a young woman strapped to a table, her skin glowing faintly as veins pulsed with erratic energy. Her eyes darted toward him, pleading without words. Tubes fed experimental variations of the serum into her bloodstream in a desperate attempt to correct what Vought had done to her. Beerus raised one finger. The tubes disintegrated into dust. The restraint snapped without sound. The glow under her skin faded slowly, like a light dimming at the end of its life. She slumped onto the table, breathing normally for the first time in years. Around the room, the same thing happened to every test subject at once. Machinery failed. Injectors died. Containment systems lost power. The artificial transformations unraveled, leaving behind only exhausted, confused humans. The scientists above began shouting orders, scrambling to trigger containment protocols. Beerus finally looked up at them. His eyes narrowed slightly. "This," he said quietly, "is what they truly built." Wise nodded. "Yes, the part they never advertised." Beerus lifted his hand toward the ceiling. The entire observation deck folded inward like paper crushed by an invisible fist. Not violently, not explosively, just compressed into a dense block of metal and glass that fell harmlessly to the floor with a heavy thud. The scientists inside were pinned but alive, trapped in a monument to their own work. Beerus turned in a slow circle, taking in the rest of the facility. Miles of underground corridors, storage vaults, testing chambers, records of experiments no one outside this desert had ever seen. His tail flicked once, and the ground began to sink. Not crack, not explode, sink. The entire structure lowered into the earth as if gravity had increased only for it. Walls bent inward, ceilings dipped, equipment warped and folded. Within seconds, the massive hidden complex had been pressed into a compact shape beneath the desert sand. From above, satellites captured a strange sight. A section of desert simply dipped downward and became smooth again, like a scar closing. The facility did not exist anymore. In New York, Billy Butcher watched the footage with a quiet intensity. Huey stared at the screen, stunned. Mother's Milk shook his head slowly. "He didn't blow it up," Huey said. Butcher nodded. "No, he buried it. Because explosions leave evidence. What Beerus did left nothing to investigate." Wise appeared beside Beerus again as the desert wind blew across untouched sand. "That was decisive," he commented. Beerus looked toward the horizon. "I am beginning to understand this world." "And?" Wise asked. Beerus didn't answer. Because at that moment, something else happened. Across the planet, every remaining hidden Vought facility experienced the same event simultaneously. Underground labs in Siberia, mountain bunkers in South America, coastal research sites in Asia. They all sank quietly into the ground within seconds, erased without spectacle. Governments watching from satellites felt a chill run through command centers. This being wasn't traveling. He was deciding. In Vought Tower, Stan Edgar received the reports one after another. Every secret location they had protected for decades was gone in under a minute. Entire black-budget operations erased without warning. Edgar closed his eyes briefly. "Total loss," someone whispered. Homelander paced the room like a caged animal. "We can still fix this," he insisted. "We can still." Edgar interrupted him calmly. "No." Homelander stopped. Edgar looked at him with a clarity that made the words heavier. "This is no longer about fixing anything. This is about surviving what he decides next. Back in the desert, Beerus stood in silence. For the first time since arriving, his irritation had settled into something else. Disappointment. They knew, Beerus said quietly. They knew this was wrong. Wise nodded. Yes, that is why they hid it. Beerus looked up at the sky. Then they cannot claim ignorance. Far away, Supes around the world watched the same reports. They saw hidden facilities erased. They saw the proof of experiments they never knew existed. They began to realize that the source of their powers was darker than even they had imagined. Panic shifted into something worse. Guilt. Because if this being was judging the world based on compound V, then they were part of the evidence. Beerus vanished again without a sound. Wise followed. And this time, they did not reappear near Vought, or any facility or any city. They appeared high above the planet, floating in space. Beerus looked down at Earth in silence. And for the first time, Wise did not speak. Because this was the point where judgment stopped being local and started becoming planetary. Beerus floated in silence above the curve of the Earth, arms loosely at his sides, tail drifting slowly behind him. From this distance, there were no cities, no towers, no humans arguing about narratives. There was only a blue planet turning peacefully in the dark. Wise hovered a short distance away, staff resting lightly in his hand. Below them, panic moved like a storm. Governments tried to establish contact with each other, as if cooperation could solve something this far beyond politics. Military satellites remained locked onto Beerus' position even though every analyst knew it was pointless. News networks speculated wildly, using words like entity, alien, weapon, anything that avoided saying what people were beginning to suspect. This was not an invader. This was a judge. In Vought Tower, Stan Edgar stood in a darkened command room watching live satellite feeds of Beerus in orbit. The glass was gone from the building, the systems fried, the company hollowed out. For the first time, Edgar had nothing left to manage. Homelander stood beside him, staring at the same image. "He's leaving," Homelander said almost hopefully. Edgar shook his head slowly. "No, he's thinking." Across the world, Supes felt something change in the air again. Not a loss of power this time, but a pressure in their chest, like standing at the edge of a cliff without knowing if the ground would hold. A-Train sat on a hospital bed, staring at the TV. Queen Maeve watched from an apartment with the curtains open. Starlight stood on a rooftop, eyes fixed on the sky. They all felt the same thing. They were being weighed. Billy Butcher stood outside, looking up without a screen. He didn't need one. He could feel it too, a strange stillness settling over the city like the pause before a verdict. "He's deciding," Butcher muttered. Huey looked uneasy. "Deciding what?" Butcher didn't answer. Because he already knew. High above, Beerus finally spoke. "This world altered its balance knowingly," he said. "They understood the consequences and continued anyway." Wise nodded gently. "Yes, but they also fear what they have done." Beerus' eyes remained fixed on the planet. Fear after the fact is meaningless. Wise tilted his head. "Perhaps, but they are capable of change." Beerus was silent for several seconds. Then he raised one hand slowly. On Earth, every screen flickered again. Phones, televisions, billboards, laptops, even broken displays inside Vought Tower sparked back to life for a moment. A live image of Beerus in orbit filled them all at once, his figure small against the vastness of space. People froze in streets, homes, hospitals, offices, watching in complete silence. Beerus wasn't speaking to a person. He was speaking to the planet. "You built false gods from fear," he said calmly, his voice somehow reaching every device at once. "You altered yourselves to feel powerful without understanding power." People stared at screens, unable to look away. You hid your worst actions beneath the ground and called it progress. You worshipped weakness wrapped in spectacle and called it strength. Stan Edgar watched without blinking. Homelander clenched his fists. Billy Butcher listened with quiet intensity. Beerus lowered his hand slightly. This world is unstable because of your choices. Wise watched silently as billions of humans absorbed the same message at once. Then Beerus' eyes narrowed. But it is not beyond correction. A wave of relief swept across the planet, so suddenly it was almost physical. People didn't even realize they had been holding their breath until that moment. Beerus continued. The substance you created will never function as it did again. Supes everywhere felt a strange calm settle into their bodies. The instability stopped, not because their powers returned, but because the uncertainty ended. Compound V inside them had been permanently silenced. You will never manufacture power again, Beerus said, not without consequence. In Vought Tower, Edgar understood the magnitude of that statement. This wasn't punishment. This was a permanent change to reality. Beerus' gaze softened slightly, though his tone did not. You will live without pretending to be gods. He lowered his hand completely. Screens went dark. Across the world, people stood in stunned silence. Supes felt their abilities settle into something weaker, quieter, no longer dominant over everyone around them. Governments stared at monitors, realizing their greatest geopolitical asset had just been neutralized by a single being without a fight. Billy Butcher exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, that's that. But high above, Beerus was still watching. Because this was not the end of his judgment. It was only the first decision. And he had not yet decided what to do about the ones who built it all. Vought Tower had never been this quiet. No executives shouting into phones, no PR teams drafting statements, no analysts predicting market recovery. The building felt like an abandoned monument to a religion that had lost its god overnight. Stan Edgar remained in the command room long after the screens went dark. The emergency lights hummed softly overhead, casting long shadows across broken glass and burnt-out panels. He did not try to leave. He did not call anyone. He simply waited. Homelander paced behind him, agitation growing into something unstable. He said it's over, Homelander insisted. He said we're done. Edgar shook his head slightly. No, he said the world is done pretending. Before Homelander could respond, the air in the room shifted. Beerus appeared without warning. Wise materialized beside him a second later, expression calm as ever. Homelander froze mid-step. His instincts screamed at him to attack, to reassert control, but something deeper held him still. He knew now that this wasn't a fight he could enter. Beerus looked at Edgar first. You understood what you were doing, Beerus said. Edgar met his gaze without hesitation. Yes. You continued anyway. Yes. There was no excuse, no attempt to justify decades of decisions. Beerus nodded once, then you accept the consequence. Edgar's expression did not change. Yes. Homelander stepped forward, anger breaking through fear. You can't just. Beerus raised one finger. Homelander's voice stopped mid-word, not choked, not silenced by force, simply removed from the air as if sound itself refused to carry his protest. Beerus walked past him and approached Edgar. You built an empire on false divinity, Beerus said quietly. You will spend the rest of your life watching it collapse into something ordinary. Edgar didn't look away. Beerus tapped the floor lightly with his finger. Every financial account, hidden reserve, offshore asset, and encrypted fund vault possessed vanished in that instant. Not transferred, not stolen, erased. Global markets flickered as Vaught's entire economic footprint disappeared from existence like a deleted file. In cities around the world, Vought-owned properties lost power simultaneously. Corporate offices went dark. Servers failed. Backup systems died. The company didn't just go bankrupt. It ceased to function. Homelander stared in shock as alerts flooded the ruined screens. What did you do? Beerus glanced at him briefly. Remove the incentive. Wise watched with quiet fascination. A corporation without resources is merely a name. Edgar understood perfectly. Vought would not be remembered as a fallen empire. It would be remembered as a mistake. Beerus turned his attention to Homelander. For the first time, his eyes held something sharper than irritation. You were the face of their illusion, Beerus said. Homelander tried to speak, but his voice still refused to obey him. You believed you were a god because they told you so, Beerus continued. You never questioned why. Beerus stepped closer. Homelander's knees weakened without him realizing it. Beerus placed 2 fingers gently against Homelander's chest. Not a strike, not a blast. A touch. Homelander gasped as something inside him shifted. The artificial strength that remained from Compound V didn't disappear, but it changed. It felt smaller, contained, no longer overwhelming. Beerus removed his hand. You will live, he said calmly, but you will live knowing what you are. Homelander fell to his knees, not from pain, but from the crushing realization that he was no longer the apex of anything. Beerus turned away. Edgar watched him go, finally understanding the scale of what had happened. This was not revenge, not destruction. It was correction. You're sparing us, Edgar said quietly. Beerus paused. I am leaving you to face what you made, he replied. Wise smiled faintly as they began to fade from the room. An elegant solution, Wise remarked. And then they were gone. Silence returned to Vought Tower. Homelander remained on his knees, staring at his hands. Edgar stood alone in the ruined command room, watching the last remnants of his empire flicker out. Across the world, news broke that Vought International had collapsed completely. Assets gone, leadership missing, systems dead. Governments scrambled to seize what remained, only to find there was almost nothing left to claim. Billy Butcher watched the reports with a slow, satisfied nod. Guess that's the end of them, Huey said. Butcher shook his head slightly. No, he replied, that's the beginning of living without them. High above the planet, Beerus and Wise floated once more in silence. Beerus looked down at Earth again. His decision was almost complete. But one final choice remained. Weeks passed without Beerus returning. No flashes in the sky, no screens hijacked, no invisible pressure settling over cities. The absence of his presence became its own kind of weight, a quiet reminder that the world had been seen, measured, and left behind. And nothing returned to normal. Supes still existed, but they no longer dominated anything. Their abilities had stabilized into something diminished, unreliable, human-adjacent. Some retired quietly. Some tried to continue their old roles, only to find that people no longer looked at them with awe. They looked at them with suspicion, sometimes pity. The worship was gone. In New York, the shattered glass of Vought Tower had been replaced with temporary boards. Government agencies moved through the building like archaeologists exploring a fallen civilization. They found empty servers, dead terminals, and hollow rooms where secrets used to live. Stan Edgar sat in a plain interrogation room, not as a corporate titan, but as a man answering questions no one had dared ask him before. He did not resist. He did not deny. For the first time, he had nothing to protect. Homelander stayed out of public view. When he finally appeared weeks later, it wasn't in the sky or on a stage. It was on a street, walking among civilians who barely glanced at him. He felt their indifference like a physical blow. The strength in his body meant nothing without the fear and admiration that had once surrounded him. He understood now what Beerus had done. He had not destroyed Homelander. He had removed the illusion that made him powerful. Billy Butcher watched the changes unfold with a strange calm. The war he had devoted his life to was simply over. No final battle, no glorious victory, just a quiet shift where the enemy lost its foundation overnight. Huey asked him one evening, "Do you miss it?" Butcher thought for a long moment. "No," he said, "I miss having something to hate." Around the world, governments tried to replicate Compound V in secret labs, hoping to regain what they had lost. Every attempt failed. The serum still existed chemically, but it no longer responded. Scientists called it a dead compound, something that should work but didn't. They never understood why. Far above the planet, Beerus watched one last time. Wise floated beside him, staff glowing faintly. "They are attempting to repeat the mistake," Wise said. Beerus observed quietly, and failing. "Will you intervene again?" Wise asked. Beerus shook his head. "No, they understand now." On Earth, people slowly adjusted to a world without manufactured gods. Crime rose briefly, then stabilized as ordinary systems adapted. Cities learned to rely on human institutions again instead of caped figures in the sky. Children grew up hearing about Supes as a strange chapter in history, not an aspiration. Vought became a cautionary tale. Beerus' eyes softened slightly as he looked at the planet. "They are fragile," he said. Wise smiled. "Yes, but they learn." Beerus turned away from Earth. "I am finished here." Wise nodded, "For now." They began to drift away from the planet, disappearing into the vast darkness of space as quietly as they had arrived. Below, no one noticed the moment Beerus finally left. But the consequences of his visit remained etched into the structure of the world itself. Supes were no longer gods. Vought was no longer powerful. And humanity no longer believed power could be injected into a vein and sold as salvation. Because once a real God had looked at them, they understood something they could never forget. They had been pretending. And far beyond their sight, in the silent void of space, Beerus did not look back. Not because the world was safe, but because it no longer offended him enough to erase.